years ago, so some of this may not be fresh in your mind. But I want to make sure that we're on the same page in terms of terminology and basic ideas. These are terms, concepts that we're going to be using throughout the semester, and I want to be clear what I'm talking about, how I want you to use these terms in our discussions and in your writing. First, I want to talk about variables. We talk a lot about variables in this class. Mostly independent variables and dependent variables. What's an independent variable? Yes?
The variable that's being manipulated.
Right, so it's the variable that's being manipulated. It's the variable that defines the groups you're comparing. Right? The independent variable is the variable that defines the groups you're comparing. So if my independent variable is sex, then I'm comparing groups that differ in their sex. For example, males and females. So the independent variable is the variable that defines the groups you're comparing. Now, it can be manipulated. Optimally, it's manipulated. But for a variable to be manipulated, it means that the researcher has to be able to randomly assign subjects to the different levels of that variable. So if I want to randomly assign, say I have a group of dogs, and I want to randomly assign one group of dogs to eat a food called Kroger Kibble, and I want to randomly assign another group of dogs to eat a food called Chunks and Lumps, and I want to randomly assign another group of dogs to eat Purina 1. Okay? I have total control over which group each dog goes into. I can randomly assign them to those different groups. That is a manipulated variable. That's different than what we call a subject variable, which can also be an independent variable. A subject variable is a variable where the levels reflect naturally existing groups. So if sex is my independent variable, and the levels are male and female, these are naturally existing groups that reflect sex, that's a subject variable, and it's not manipulated, because when you come into my lab, I can't randomly assign you to be male or female. Chances are you're already pre-assigned one of those. So all independent variables have levels. All variables have levels of some kind. Variables have to vary. They have to have more than one condition, more than one case, in order for it to be a variable. The other kind of variable, dependent variable, is measured. A dependent variable is what we're going to compare about the groups we're looking at. It's the thing we're going to measure about them, and then we're going to make a comparison to see if there's a difference between how group A did something and group B did that same thing. So dependent variables are measured. Independent variables are, for the most part, manipulated. Sometimes they're not, but optimally we want a manipulated independent variable where I can use random assignment. When we talk about variables, we also have to think about whether we're working with conceptual definitions or operational definitions. Now, conceptual definition is very general. It's where you're talking about a construct. So, for example, memory. Memory is a construct. It's a thing that we know exists, but it has a lot of different dimensions. There's short-term memory and long-term memory and episodic memory and semantic memory and working memory, and there's all these different things about memory. It's a big idea. And it's just memory. We know it exists. People study memory. We do 4 chapters on it in cognitive psychology on memory. Okay. But that's a conceptual definition. Okay, when I say memory, if I say something like, memory is our ability to store information and retrieve it based on previous experience. There's memory. That's a conceptual definition. An operational definition for a variable is one that is specifically linked to how that variable is being measured or manipulated in your study. So if I say, I am going to measure short-term memory in terms of how many numbers my participants can recall from a list after being given 10 seconds to look at that list. That's an operational definition of short-term memory. And it's operational because it's how I am going to operate on this variable in this particular case. So conceptual definitions are, these kind of broad, general definitions that don't apply to any particular study. They can apply to all different things. But an operational definition is one that is directly connected to the design or implementation of that variable in a particular case. Now, the alternative to something being a variable is that it's a constant. Okay? If something varies, it's a variable. If it has different manifestations in the world, it's a variable. If it doesn't have different manifestations, then it's a constant. So if I was doing a study with dogs, and all of my dogs in the study were English bulldogs, which would be optimal because they're the best dog. Okay? My favorite breed of dog, and they're the best kind. So I would, of course, want to bring lots of bulldogs into my lab because they're great. And if I had only English bulldogs in my study, then dog breed is a constant because it's not varying. I don't have different breeds of dogs in my study, so it's a constant. I'm holding it constant. If I were to bring in English bulldogs and then some greyhounds and then some German shepherds, now dog breed would be a variable because it has different manifestations, right? Now I'm going to compare 3 different breeds of dogs in terms of their performance on some measure. So if something is not a variable, then it's a constant. And in order for something to be a variable, you have to be able to identify more than one manifestation of it in the world, like English bulldogs and greyhounds, in order for dog breed to be a variable. When we talk about claims, scientific claims, we're talking about not just ideas, but an argument, a rational, logical, scientific argument that the researcher is trying to make about a particular theory, a particular hypothesis, and a particular set of data. So if I ask you to think about different kinds of claims, it's not like, I claim the sky is blue. That's not an argument. We're talking about, what's the setup? What's the problem that needs to be solved? What is the way that this study is solving the problem? What findings do they get from their study? And do those findings support or refute the hypothesis that they're testing? That all of that is their argument. The case they're trying to make, the story they're trying to sell you in their paper. Now we talk about several different kinds of claims: frequency claims, association claims, and causal claims. Frequency claims are about a single variable. When we make a frequency claim in research, we are reporting things like percentages, proportions, straight numbers. 10 out of 15 subjects did something. 50% of Americans have experienced severe depression at some time in their lives, something like that. Frequency claims are purely descriptive, and they are always focused on measured variables. So we're talking about dependent variables. So when you read descriptive statistics in a research article, or in a news story, or anyplace else, when you see descriptive statistics, things like the mean or the standard deviation or things like that, range, proportions, percentages, those are all frequency claims. We get a little bit more sophisticated or conceptually complex when we move up to association claims. Association claims aren't about a single variable, but about 2 or more variables and how they are influencing each other, how they're connected. So when we perform correlations or regressions, when we're trying to say that there's a connection between 2 measured variables, we're trying to make a prediction about how someone will do on one variable given what we know about their performance on another variable, we are making an association claim. We're saying that there's a connection between these 2 for some reason. Knowing the value of one of these variables will give us a clue about the value for another variable. So, for example, if we can think of two variables: how much you study and how good a grade you get on a test. So you can study for so many hours, and typically, the more hours you study, the higher your score is on the test, right? Now, if that's the case, if one variable increases in value and the other variable also increases in value, and there's an association between the two, we say that there's a positive correlation. It's also true, though, that if one variable goes down and the other variable goes down, that's also a positive correlation. Because positive correlation is about the two variables moving in the same direction. It's not about whether they go up or down. It's about whether they're moving in the same direction, or, in the case of a negative correlation, different directions. So the association can be strong or weak. It might be a really good predictor of how well you're going to do on a test, how much you study. But we all know it's not a perfect predictor, right? That's why this is an association, not a causal claim. Because we all know there are times when you study your butt off, and you still sometimes don't get a good grade. There are also times where you just kind of casually look at your notes before the test and rock it, right? And sometimes it doesn't seem to matter what you do, right? I mean, so sometimes it works great, sometimes it doesn't work, but typically the case is that the more you study, the more effectively you study, the better your score will be on a test, typically. And that's what association claims are about. They're about making a prediction, not making something happen. But saying that this becomes more likely under these circumstances. Not that it's going to happen for sure, but that it's more likely. And again, as with frequency claims, association claims are made about dependent variables. Okay, so when we're talking about an association claim, we're talking about connections between dependent variables. And then we have the type of claim that we focus on most in this class, which is the causal claim. A causal claim has to do with one variable making another variable change in a particular way. We are making something happen. We are controlling the way that one variable appears by manipulating a variable to begin with. So we're focusing on two or more variables. Always the case that you have at least two. One is an independent variable, the other is a dependent variable. So one has to be manipulated, the other has to be measured. In order to establish cause, in order to demonstrate that there's a causal relationship between two variables, we have to meet three criteria. First of all, the two variables have to be reasonably correlated. It has to make sense that the two variables would have some influence on each other. So it makes sense that how much you study could have an influence on how well you do on a test. That's a reasonable association. Something would not be reasonable. How depressed you are is probably not connected to how well you can make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Okay? Those are not connected. There's no reasonable relationship between those two things. So you have to have a meaningful correlation between the two variables. Next, you have to have directionality. You have to have a time-order relationship between the changes in the variables. So in the case of an experiment, you set up the independent variable and you assign the subjects to the different conditions in the variable. And that happens first. So you create the change in the independent variable, and then you have the subjects in the different conditions perform the behavior, and you observe what happens with the dependent variable. So changes in the independent variable always precede any differences in the dependent variable. Okay, that's the time-order relationship. So you have to have clear directionality. It has to be obvious that it was the changes in the IV that caused the changes in the DV. And one of the ways we do that is by setting up a time-order relationship. So nothing happens with the dependent variable until you have set up the differences in the independent variable. Lastly, you have to eliminate any other possible explanation for changes in the dependent variable other than the independent variable. And we call those other variables third variables. They can also be called extraneous variables. These are variables that you are not controlling, things that could be influencing the subject's behavior, that could be influencing how they do on the dependent variable. And you need to control those as much as possible. You need to eliminate them as alternative explanations for changes in the dependent variable, or you can't make a causal claim. If you have a third variable that's extraneous, it could be threatening, it could be not threatening to your causal claim. If I'm doing a study with bulldogs and I'm asking them to eat different types of dog food, and I have the dogs come in over the course of a day. So some dogs are coming in to eat in the morning, some are coming in the middle of the day, some are coming in the evening. Well, time of day is now a variable, right? Because when they're coming in to participate in my study is different for different dogs. So it's varying. Do I think it's going to impact how much they eat? Well, it could, but that makes it an extraneous variable, and that means I need to think about it. And if time of day is an issue, it could potentially threaten my study. Now, if, for example, I did something crazy, which of course I would never do, like have all the dogs who are eating Kroger kibble eat in the morning, and all the dogs who are eating Purina One eat in the middle of the day, and all the dogs who are eating chunks and lumps eat in the evening, I would have created not just an extraneous variable, but a confound, right? A confounding variable. Because now I can't tell the difference between the levels of my independent variable and this other variable of time of day. I can't tell whether how much food they eat has anything to do with the type of food, or if it's all about what time of day they ate. Maybe dogs who eat at night always eat more, always eat less. I don't know. Yes?
Are third variables and compounds synonymous, or is there like a slight difference?
Excuse me?
Is there third variables and compounds synonymous, or is there a slight difference?
There are always going to be some third variable somewhere. So third variables and extraneous variables, yes. Some extraneous variables are also confounds. But not all extraneous variables are confounds. So, I mean, if I do a study and I have dogs come in, some come in the morning, some come in at noon, some come in the evening, because I just can't only have so many dogs in my lab, that's an extraneous variable. But if I make sure that I have dogs who come in the morning, eat all the different types of food, and dogs who come in the middle of the day eat all the different types of food, and dogs come in at the end of the day eat all the different types of food, then it should be the case that whatever effect time of day has on my dog's behavior, it should be evenly distributed across my 3 different food groups. So it shouldn't be a problem. So there are ways that you can deal with extraneous variables so that they don't cause a problem for your study. But if they become confounding variables, then you're in trouble. Does that work? Now, here's where we get to the important stuff. Different types of validity. Students often struggle with the different types of validity, understanding how they're different, and how to evaluate studies in terms of these different types of validity. We're going to do a lot with these 4 types of validity. Your textbook is written around these 4 types of validity. So I want you to master the differences between these 4. Be confident about it. Because when we write in this class, and we start writing about peer-reviewed research, and evaluating that research, you are going to be evaluating the articles in terms of, the studies that are presented in the articles, in terms of these different types of validity. And what we're hoping for, when we have a good study, you've got a study that has good construct validity, good statistical validity, good internal validity, and good external validity. And these are not, it's not either it has it or it doesn't have it. Validity exists on a continuum. So you can have good construct validity, not as good, a little bit less good, bad, or high or low. It's not either they have it or they don't. So we have to, it's a little bit subjective, and you have to make a case for why you think a particular study has good construct validity or good statistical validity. You have to be able to make a case. And in order to do that, you have to understand how the different types of validity differ from each other, what each one is really focused on, and what we'll also talk a bit about today, where in the article you can actually find information that's relevant to each of these different types of validity. So let's start first by talking about each one. Construct validity has to do with how well the variables in the study are set up. So if I have a good independent variable, it means that I've created a variable that results in good comparison groups, meaningful comparison groups. For example, if I wanted to compare reading comprehension in readers of American English, and I set up a study that compared children who were 5 years old, 5.5 years old, and 6 years old, that makes a lot of sense because that's a stage where children are typically learning how to read, and the gaps between them, the 6-month gaps, are large enough that we could reasonably observe differences between the groups, because in 6 months kids learn a lot about reading, and in a whole year they learn a lot. We would expect to see meaningful differences between groups that were compared in that interval. What would not make sense, what would give me bad construct validity or low construct validity, would be if I was comparing kids who were 5 years old with kids who were 15 years old. And then kids who were, or I can't say kids anymore, 25 years old, even though they're kids to me, because I'm old. If I compared 5-year-olds and 15-year-olds and 25-year-olds on reading comprehension, that would not be good. I would not have good construct validity. That doesn't make any sense. Obviously, people who are 15 read better than people who are 5. And obviously, people who are 25 probably read better than people who are 15 and who are 5. So that doesn't make any sense. Why would I do that kind of comparison? So you need to, when you evaluate a study in terms of construct validity, you want to think about the variables and think about, are they well made? You know, we talk about constructing a costume, of course, because I'm thinking about Dragon Con, right? You talk about constructing a garment or constructing a house, right? You're thinking about how well made is it. And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about how well made are the variables. If I talk about depression, and I'm measuring depression, it makes sense to measure depression in terms of an established measure, like scores on the Beck Depression Inventory. That's a reasonable way to measure depression. If I'm going to figure out who's depressed and who's not, or how depressed someone is. It's not reasonable for me to say, well, I'm going to measure depression in terms of speed with which you can make tuna salad. It doesn't make any sense. Of course, nobody would ever really do that, but it's not reasonable. So construct validity has to do with the variables themselves and whether or not they are good variables for exploring the topic that the researcher is investigating. Statistical validity has to do with type 1 and type 2 error. Researchers are always wrestling with type 1 and type 2 error when they start to do inferential statistics. What's type 1 error? You reject the null hypothesis, but you should have kept it, right? So we can think of type 1 error as a false alarm. You incorrectly found a significant difference in your sample that does not exist in the population. And it results from problems with your design. Okay, you did something wrong in your study. The way you set it up, the way you ran it, what you controlled, what you didn't control. You did something wrong. It might have been intent, you probably didn't mean to do it, but something went wrong. And you found a difference where in fact none exists. You guys know why we call this type 1 error? Why it's number 1?
Most frequently?
Well, I don't know if it's the most frequent, but I think it's the most important kind of error, the one we want to avoid the most. And this is why. If someone finds a statistically significant difference between some groups, and they publish those results, and people read those published results that say there are significant differences between these two groups, then that has a much greater likelihood of resulting in people changing the course of their own research to take, because you have this new evidence. It changes the story. A significant difference changes the story that people, the information that people have to work with. And it can actually cause more trouble. If you're reporting bad data, right? It's like trying to make a good decision based on bad information. And we don't want to waste time, waste money, waste participants' lives, whatever. You know, we don't, if someone says, there's a significant difference between this treatment and how likely people are to live if you give them this versus this, and one of them costs 10 times more than the other one, but still, this one's better, so we'll use it. You could waste a lot of money paying for the significantly better treatment that isn't actually significantly better. So it's a big deal to falsely report, whether you're doing it on purpose or not. It's a big deal to falsely report a significant difference that isn't really there. Type 2 error is where you fail to notice a significant difference in the sample that really does exist in the population. So basically it's a miss. You should have seen something if you'd set your study up right, if you had a representative sample, if you gather your data effectively, then you should have observed a difference between your groups. And for some reason, you didn't. There were too many extraneous variables or something. And so you missed a difference that was actually there. Now this is still not a good thing to do, which is why it's an error, but it's not, sorry, let me check. It's not something that is necessarily going to change the course of people's science. Okay? If someone finds a null result, if they say there was no difference between these groups, researchers are much more likely to continue exploring the way they were exploring. They're not going to stop investigating, because we all know that sometimes you can look for something and not find it. We've all looked for things and not been able to find them. And sometimes it just means you need to change your strategy, switch something up, try again. And people do that in science too. But we still don't want to do that if we can help it. I mean, we really do want our results to reflect what's happening in the population. That's what we want. So, but we're struggling to get the message right. We want our sample to look like the population. We want the results we get to accurately reflect what's happening in the population. And we have to evaluate the study in terms of how convinced we are that when I see a significant result in that results section, I believe it, I trust it, I think it's correct. Or if they don't find a difference, how confident am I that that lack of a difference is real and that it's not an artifact of some lack of control or bad decision making on the researcher's part. Internal validity applies only to experiments, only to causal claims. Internal validity has to do with the presence or absence of confounds. If a study has confounds, if a study has extraneous variables that could be influencing the result, then internal validity drops. Internal validity is about how confident I am that any change that's observed between, in the dependent variable, based on changes in the independent variable, is true. I want to be confident about that influence, that relationship. And if there's anything that's getting in the way of my confidence of that causal relationship, the internal validity of the studies goes down. External validity is all about generalizability. All about how representative the sample was, how confident I am that the results I found in this case can generalize effectively to the particular population that I'm attempting to describe. So we want to be able to analyze all the different types of claims in terms of these types of validity. Well, technically, we can evaluate frequency claims in terms of construct validity, a little bit of statistical validity, and external validity. Association claims, we can evaluate in terms of construct validity, statistical validity, and external validity. Causal claims, all four. Now, if you take a look at the handout, and everybody get a copy of the handout? If you didn't get one, you want to come down and get one right now? Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. So we are going to to be evaluating studies in terms of their claims and the different types of validity. Just relax. Sorry, it sounds like, oh, it's that thing. I was like, is this thing making noise? Like, why are you making sounds? Just relax. Okay. So, if I give you a claim, like half of Americans struggle with depression, that's a frequency claim, right? Because it's about, all I'm doing is reporting a proportion, right? 50%. So one thing you're going to need to be able to do is recognize what type of claim I'm giving you, frequency claim, association claim, or causal claim, by looking at the wording. Looking at, is this one variable or two? Are we talking about manipulated variables or measured variables? So by knowing the characteristics of the different types of claims, you should be able to identify. If I say, happy people have more meaningful conversations, that's an association claim. Why? Because we're talking about two variables, happiness and ability to have a meaningful conversation. And we're talking about making a prediction, right? That if you're happy, then you're more likely to do this. We're not saying that if you are happy, you will have more meaningful conversations, because unhappy people can have meaningful conversations. Happy people can have completely meaningless conversations. Try talking to a really happy drunk person. There is no meaningfulness in them. It's just one giant vowel movement. It's not very meaningful at all, but they might be really, really happy. Happy and completely incoherent, right? If I give you a statement like, listening to classical music increases your IQ. Now, this is a causal relationship, right? Because I'm saying that if you do this, this other thing will happen. That's a causal relationship. So you should be able to identify particular claims by thinking about the wording, thinking about the characteristics of the different type of claims, and be able to match it up. And I can tell you right now, on the test, I'll give you a claim and say, which kind of claim is it? And A, B, C, D, go. Yeah.
Can't some claims be both though? Like if it was half of Americans struggle with depression because of traffic, couldn't that be like frequency and also maybe like causal?
You can say that the claim probably wouldn't be stated that way. What you're doing is fusing two different claims. So the frequency claim is half of Americans are depressed, and the causal claim is depression is caused by traffic, which is true. I think we could probably also argue that rage, frustration, anger in Atlanta. Oh man, it's the worst. It is the worst. So you want to separate out the claims. I mean, we can fuse lots of concepts into a single thing, but when I present a claim to you on a test, I will present them in a clear way. So I won't fuse claims. I'm not going to try and give you these triple claim questions. I don't want to do that. I want to try and be very clear. So when I give you a statement, it won't be something fused like that. Now, this chart also appears in your textbook. I think it's actually in the front cover, right? But you don't always have your textbook with you. Some of you have electronic copies, so I wanted to make sure that you had this handout. But if you look down each of the columns, you'll see the kinds of questions you have to ask to evaluate each type of claim in terms of each type of validity. So, for example, if you want to evaluate a frequency claim, say you're reading a paper and you realize that there's a frequency claim being made in that paper, then you can evaluate the construct validity of that claim by asking about the variable. So if I say half of Americans struggle with depression, then the question I need to ask is, well, how well have they measured depression? If you want to say half of Americans have struggled with that, well, how do you know? Are you talking about half of the people, half of the people who've gone in for any kind of medical treatment and been administered depression inventory have depression? Or have the symptoms of depression? I mean, how are you measuring depression? How do you know that? Are you just asking people, are you depressed? Or are you actually having some kind of standardized measure like the Beck Depression Inventory being applied? So how well are they measuring that particular variable? We talk about statistical validity for that, for a frequency claim. Really the most you can do is evaluate it in terms of margin of error. How likely is that proportion of percentage to be on the money? Or how much wiggle room is there? Because we know that with every sample, there is sampling error. There are no perfect samples. Right? Populations always differ to some degree from the sample. It depends on how representative the sample is of the population. But even the most representative sample is going to have some error. As a result, you always have to have some wiggle room. So it might not really be 50%, it might be 48%, or it might be 53%. But you need to see what's the margin of error. And if the margin of error is large, then you don't have very good statistical validity. If the margin of error is small, then you have better statistical validity in this case. We don't evaluate internal validity with frequency claims because there's nothing to be confounded, right? You have to have an independent variable and a dependent variable in order to evaluate internal validity. We don't have that here, so you don't have to worry about it. Yay! What that means is if I ask you to evaluate a frequency claim, don't start talking to me about internal validity because there isn't any to talk about. Okay? Just warning. Don't do it. But we can talk about external validity. What population settings and times can we generalize this to? So when I say all Americans, who am I really talking about? Am I talking about really all Americans? Am I talking about Americans who have access to mental health care? Or am I talking about Americans between the ages of 18 and 25? Or am I talking about Americans who identify as white? Who am I talking about? Okay. So, I mean, you kind of have teenagers, like 95% struggle with depression because they're parents. Right? I have one, believe me. She tells me all the time about her struggle. It's hard having me for a mom, poor thing. All right. So we can ask about the representation of the sample. We can ask about whether or not the sample was taken randomly or whether it was a convenient sample. We can do all those things with a frequency claim. So you can just use this as a checklist. If you've identified the kind of claim and then you have to evaluate the claim in terms of validity, this just reminds you what questions you need to ask. Now, if we go to association claims, pretty much the same thing. The new thing here is that now we can evaluate statistical validity in a slightly more sophisticated way. Because once you start doing things like correlations and regressions, you start getting a significant correlation or statistically significant regression, then you can start asking about type 1 and type 2 error. So, we want to know, to what extent do I believe the finding? Or do I think that the significant result might be a false alarm? Is there any chance that the researchers are missing a relationship that really does exist in the world? And then I want to think about things like effect size. Did you guys talk about effect size in 3510? Remember how much of an effect an independent variable or how much of an effect a variable has on another one? Talk about things like Cohen's d, right? All that. Well, we're going to talk all about that stuff. It keeps coming. You never get away from effect size. So, if you have a really large effect size, that's a more compelling case for a truly significant difference than a really small effect size. So you want to look at things like that to give you a clue. We don't, again, assess internal validity because we're not looking at cause. You don't have confounds in correlations. So don't have to worry about internal validity. And external validity is the same, right? How representative is the sample? How do we generalize it to other groups, settings, times, and so forth. Now we get to causal claims. And now we've got same thing with construct validity, same thing with statistical validity, but now we move into internal validity for the first time. So if we're talking about experiments, we need to talk about internal validity. Because here's where you're trying to establish a causal claim, and that can only happen if the internal validity is high. The lower the internal validity, the weaker the causal claim. You might even get to a place where you can't even make a causal claim because the internal validity is not high enough. The first question you ask when you do this is, was this study an experiment? And in this case, what we mean is, was it a true experiment? Do you know the difference between a true experiment and a quasi-experiment?
Control.
Control. It's all about control. Experimenters love control. A true experiment is one in which the independent variable is manipulated. If I can, as a researcher, randomly assign the subjects to the different conditions defined by the independent variable, then I have a true experiment. However, if the independent variable is not a manipulated variable like that, but instead a subject variable, one that reflects previously existing groups, like males and females, because I can't randomly assign you to your sex when you come into the lab. Well, today you're going in the male group. Tomorrow, if you came in, you could go in the female group. We don't typically do that. So if I can't randomly assign, if the groups that I'm comparing in my study reflect pre-existing groups in the world, like bulldogs and greyhounds and shepherds, then I'm talking about a subject variable. And whenever you have a subject variable, you have a quasi-experiment. And there is too much potential for extraneous variables that are unknown, extraneous variables that cannot be controlled. You cannot eliminate those variables as possible explanations for differences you might observe. And so you can't make a true causal claim. So a quasi-experiment does not permit us to make a true causal claim. And that seems kind of weird, but the example I gave last time in my other class was, think about this. So we get the idea that smoking is not a healthy thing, right? People who smoke get cancer. People who smoke die sooner. They have all other kinds of complications because of smoking, because smoking is really bad for you. In fact, you can look at the label on cigarettes, and it says things like, smoking causes cancer. Smoking causes birth defects. Smoking, you're going to die. Here's a charred black lung. They have these things on this cigarette pack. And the tobacco industry says, well, even though you're going to mandate that we do this, the truth is, there is no research showing that smoking causes cancer in humans. And they can get away with saying that because it's true. We have not done any studies where we took a group of subjects and then randomly assigned half of them to smoke and then randomly assigned the other half not to smoke to see if the smoking group got cancer. Because that's unethical. We can't do that. Hi, all group of healthy people, we're going to now give you cancer so you can die. You don't do that, right? So we've done it in animals. It's been demonstrated in animals, certainly. And that's the basis of the causal claim that's showing up on the cigarette packs. But the tobacco industry wants you to know that there is no research showing that tobacco or smoking causes cancer in humans. And that's true because we haven't ever done the true experiment because it would be wrong to do so. However, we do have a huge amount of association claim data that says pretty much this association is so strong, we're just going to kind of think of it like a causal claim. But it's not really, we can't really make that causal claim based on human data. It's based on data from animals. And the tobacco industry loves that. That's probably why people can still smoke, because we can't do the experiment. But I know I'm convinced.
It's like a catch-22. Like
It
you
is.
can't do the study
Right.
to prove it.
That's right. That's right. Because it's unethical, yeah. So, but that's the loophole, right? But anytime you have a quasi-experiment, anytime you have one of those subject variables where people have a pre-existing state, like either you smoke or don't smoke, right? And there are cases of twins where one twin smokes and the other twin doesn't smoke, and they do comparisons, and they see that the twin that smokes tends to have more health issues and so forth. You can do that, but still, you didn't assign them to those conditions. You don't know what other circumstances might have led to those differences and what other lifestyle choices may be influencing the smoking twin's health or the non-smoking twin's health. And that's why it's a quasi-experiment, why you can't make the causal claim. Right. So you need to have a true experiment. Okay. And then they say, does the study achieve temporal precedence? Sounds so fancy. But all that really means is, do the variables have that directionality, that time-order relationship that you need to establish cause? Do we see that changes in the dependent variable are always preceded by changes in the independent variable? That the dependent performance on the dependent variable is the same until you do something at the independent variable level. That's all we're saying there. Does the study control for alternative explanations by controlling confounds? This is the third variable issue, right? Have they effectively eliminated other possible interpretations for changes in the dependent variable aside from changes in the independent variable? And then lastly is, does the study avoid threats to internal validity? And I've given you a list of those down at the bottom of the page on the handout. We actually have a whole separate chapter about these. We're going to talk about these in detail when we get to our section on experiments next week. So I'm not going to go into detail about them now. But there are all these different things that can actually reduce the internal validity of a study, different external factors that can make your data less valuable. And we're going to talk about those in detail. So you're going to evaluate those things. Otherwise, talk about external validity is the same. How representative is a sample? How generalizable are the results? Does anybody have any questions about this chart? Handy reference. Don't lose it. Okay? I mean, I know it's inside your front of your book, but you don't have to carry your book around everywhere. Okay, now, I'm going to ask you, as I said, during the semester, I'm going to ask you to look at scientific studies and evaluate them in terms of these different types of validity. You're going to have to be able to identify variables. You're going to have to figure out, are they making frequency claims? Are they making association claims? Are they making causal claims? And you're going to have to figure out how well they set up their study in terms of those different types of validity. And if you're not really familiar with reading articles can be kind of overwhelming. So I made a cheat sheet for my students, special just for you, to help you know where to look in a peer-reviewed article to find information that's relevant to each of these different types of validity. So if you are reading an article, and we're going to read all experimental articles in this class. If you're reading an experimental article, or an article about an experiment, the articles are set up, typically they have a title page, abstract, introduction, method, results, discussion, right? That's the standard AP style research paper format. I just want you to have some clues you can kind of figure out in each of these places. If I ask you to tell me about the construct validity, okay, then don't give me information from the results section. You're not going to necessarily find anything about construct validity there. Construct validity stuff is going to probably be in the introduction and then in the method, for example. So this is just a cheat sheet for you. When we read articles, if I ask you to, on a worksheet, for example, to tell me what you think about the internal validity of the study, now you can go, okay, where do I need to look to find good information? Well, if I look at my cheat sheet, it seems like internal validity information is happening in the method section. That's where I'm going to find most information. So focus on the method section. Don't worry about the introduction. Don't worry about the results. Focus on the method section, as an example. So this is just to help you look in the right place, because there's so much stuff going on. The different types of validity are all mixed around in the article. So it's just a way to help you kind of figure out the right place to focus your attention to answer a particular question. And we're not going to read an article until we get through our first unit, but I just wanted you to have this together since we're talking about the forms of validity today. And I wanted you to have these two in one handout so you can just flip back and forth when you're trying to do this. Okay, does anybody have any questions about the different types of claims or the different types of validity or their connection? Is it clear? You feel good? You feel like you got this? Seems, for those of you that took 3510 in the spring, does this seem familiar? Like, okay, yeah, I remember we talked about this. This is not anything. I haven't directly said something opposite of what your teacher said. So we're still all on the same page? Are you feeling masterful? You're like, variables, got them, done. Now, you will need to be able to recognize independent variables and dependent variables in a description of a study. I'm not going to say, here's the independent variable, here's the dependent variable. I'm going to say, what is the independent variable? What is the dependent variable? So again, shortcut way to remember that, because I know that's one thing students struggle with. The independent variable is the variable that defines the groups you're comparing. It's what says we're going to compare this group and this group and this group to each other. The dependent variable is what you're comparing about those groups. The dependent variable is what you do the math on. Those are the numbers you crunch. Okay. So when we're reading about studies and you're reading a description of a study, and if I ask you to identify the independent variable, think about what groups are we comparing. If you see that the study is comparing males and females, then your independent variable is sex. If you see that the group is comparing people who have severe, moderate, and no depression, then your independent variable is depression, or level of depression. If you see that what they're comparing is how many how many alcoholic beverages they consume in a week, that's your dependent variable, because that's what you're measuring about those groups. You're gathering the same data about the groups and comparing it. That's what you're crunching. That's what you're doing the math on to see whether or not it's statistically significant. And what you want to know is it statistically significant for these groups? So independent variable defines the groups. Dependent variable is what you're comparing about the groups. And I find that with that shortcut, students tend to have a little bit easier time trying to figure it out. If you get stuck, if you get confused, just ask. I have no problem answering questions, but being able to identify variables appropriately is important. Because if you can't tell if something's an independent variable or a dependent variable, then you might not be able to tell the difference between an association claim and a causal claim. Right? Because association claims, all dependent variables. Only with the causal claim do we get independent variables in the mix. Are there any questions? Are your brains full for today? You're like, I'm feeling that weekend, it's calling me, and I really want it to call me out of the room right now. Okay, go forth and be awesome. Have a fantastic weekend.